Welcome, everyone. I'm Chris Field. I'm the director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. I'm so pleased to have you join us for today's conversation with Sir Partha Dasgupta. The Stanford Woods Institute is a hub for interdisciplinary solutions-oriented research related to sustainability. In the Woods Institute, we work on climate, food, health, water, and the broad questions of the importance of biodiversity, and I'm thrilled that that's where our conversation will go today. The Woods Institute is part of Stanford's new Dorr School of Sustainability, which is opening broad new horizons in research and solutions, and the kind of work that Partha has done over many decades really underscores the directions that we're headed. Let me say a few things about Partha. He is the Frank Ramsey Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge. His early training was in economics and physics. His PhD is in economics from the University of Cambridge, and he has worked on a wide range of topics in the economics of development, of malnutrition, but especially in the area of ecological economics that we'll talk about today. He's had academic appointments at the London School of Economics and for many years at the University of Cambridge. I'm especially proud that we had him at Stanford in the period around 1990, where he collaborated extensively with Kenneth Arrow, with Paul Ehrlich, Larry Goulder, and really set the stage for a lot of the work on natural capital that has occurred at Stanford and around the world since then. With Carl Mahler, Partha invented the concept of inclusive wealth that has really driven so much of his work and the work on natural capital. Partha's work has been recognized with a huge range of major awards: the Blue Planet Prize, the Tyler Prize, the BBVA Frontiers of Knowledge Award, and of course he's been recognized with knighthood back in 2002 and with the Grand Cross knighthood in 2023. Today we'll have a chance to talk about his recent work related to the Economics of Biodiversity, a project that he did for the British government. It was published in 2021, and I'm thrilled to be able to talk about his forthcoming book on natural capital, the value of the world around us. So welcome, Partha.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And let me start with, well, actually, let me start with one other thing. The schedule for today's conversation is that I'll ask Partha questions for maybe 20 or 25 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to questions for all of you in the audience. So start thinking now about what it is you most want to ask, and we'll get to that. If you fidget in your seats a lot, I'll know you're ready to go maybe before the 20 minutes. But I want to start with the premise that you say as empirical fact that is not nearly as widely recognized that it needs to be, that our demand on resources from nature far exceeds nature's ability to supply them. And I wonder if you could just start out by saying, what the evidence is and why we need to be concerned about it.
Right. Well, I think, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. This is my sort of spiritual home is Stanford. I may have been elsewhere, but this is where my heroes were here. Paul Ehrlich and Ken Arrow, they're two giants. So it's particularly a pleasure. I think the best way to start is to, in some ways, as an economist, and a card-carrying economist, by the way, I'm totally that, as orthodox an economist as can be. But I think in many ways we have got it wrong. my profession in thinking of the global economy or regional economies, or the human economy, let me call it that way, so you can scale it up or down depending on your mood of the moment. We think of the human economy in terms of output, and I think that's a big mistake. If we decompose the output into the factors, then if there's a great imbalance in one of the factors, which in this case is natural capital, I'll come back to the way we are thinking of it, then it should be the other way around. We ought to be thinking about economic possibilities starting not from produced capitals, but from the ground up. And so the classification that we tend to use now of natural capital, by natural capital I really mean, let's think in terms of ecosystems and the materials that are available there. We think of them producing, broadly speaking, two types of goods and services. One is goods, which is the classification that I tend to use is that of provisioning goods. These are goods which, with human labor, we can transform into final products, which at market prices are called GDP. So we're looking at water, timber, food. And the other, which is much deeper, are the what they call maintenance and regulating services that Mother Nature offers us, which produce these provisioning goods. So even although from the economic point of view, we are concerned with provisioning goods, but the real action is elsewhere. It's the if you like, the silent infrastructure which is producing these provisioning goods, which enables these provisioning goods to grow. And so these maintenance and regulating services would include things like regeneration of soil, carbon recycling in nature. Those processes which are enabling primary products to be produced or grow, which we then convert into final products. That's the scheme that I tend to think in terms of. But instead of looking at the final products, my attention was drawn really to the basis, the means by which these final products are produced. So that takes us into natural capital. Now, I think the idea here is this. We are provisioning goods, as I said, would be timber, water, and so forth. And a simple mental model of the biosphere could be like a fishery, a gigantic fishery. It's a renewable resource, self-regenerating. Of course, there are many, many products, goes without saying. So I'm thinking fisheries, of course, you concentrate only on one product. There's a multiplicity of products. But the analogy helps me a lot because we think of the biosphere as a regenerative resource. And what we draw out from it, if that exceeds the natural regenerative rate of the biosphere, it means that the biosphere shrinks, not in size, but in quality, obviously, just like in a fishery it would. So the fishery analogy is very helpful because it allows you to see it very stark form, that what you take out exceeds what its annual yield is, then the stock shrinks. And it's that which I was alluding to when we say that what we draw from nature exceeds nature's ability to supply them. And of course, there's plenty of reasons for thinking that that is the case. For example, species extinction would be one signal of the fact that you're taking more out. Reduction in the productivity of ecosystems would be another. Now, in terms of the productivity, one has to be careful because in some sense the productivity of land in producing food has shot up enormously in the last 70 years or so, goes without saying. But those are the provisioning goods which we're getting. And what it's undermining are the maintenance and regulating services in the process of transforming various forms of ecosystems, mangroves, coral reefs, forests. The transformation, mining and quarrying and land use changes, which are transforming the economy, are shifting nature's ability to produce goods and services in different forms. So what we see as very productive land is indeed correct. There's very productive land, the agricultural land, but it's at the expense of many of the maintenance and regulating services that nature can provide. So it's in that sense.
I would like to come back to the evidence base, but I also would love to hear your thoughts a little bit on the issue that you call path dependence, for why it has not been the norm in economics to consider the provision of resources from nature, and something about the insights that you brought to opening up the idea that our view of economics was incomplete without the presence of nature.
Unfortunately, that's a tough question to answer, because I'm not a historian of economic thought. I have very little understanding of it. But one possible explanation could be that the human economy globally, relative to the size of the biosphere, was small, globally. Locally, of course, there have been many, many tragedies taking place. The Mayans disappeared and so forth, but I'm not ignoring that. Globally, we were a small economy. So the demands we were making on nature was allowed for other species to flourish a lot more than they do now. We've been crowding in on them, of course, over the past. But if you were to plot human activity in forms of, say, GDP, if you use GDP as a crude measure of human activity, and if you were to plot that against time, then you would find the same hockey stick curve that you see in carbon emissions, which you are now familiar with. An incredibly steep rise, approximately 1950. 1950 is sort of, we now use it as a easy marker. But there's no mistake of it. From the last 75 years or so have been unprecedented globally. I mean, it's just rockets up. GDP just shoots up, and material uses and so forth. They're all very, very sharp increase. And so this, in some ways, I think, I'm fairly persuaded that this 75 post-war experience has so mesmerized political and economic commentators that they see, well, human ingenuity can overcome everything. But it's a very short span in the life of, if you were to plot GDP, for example, from year one, see, as Madison tried to do. It's sort of, globally, it's sort of fairly flat, takes up about 1,700 or so, 1,500, let's say, and then 1,700 picks up pretty far. But then unprecedented from about 1950. It's an extraordinary curve, just very much like the hockey stick curve that you're familiar with. So I think it may be that 100 years back or 200 years ago, economists starting on these, Malthus was, of course, an exception, and we forget how prescient he was in many ways. But on the whole, I think the idea really was that we are small relative to the biosphere is very large, if they thought in terms of the biosphere. But I think the experience of human ingenuity could transform raw materials into final products easily has influenced that.
It makes total sense to me to think in terms of kind of two phases of this great transition that you describe. I think phase one, and it's where I think traditional economics has been, is that there may be constraints from nature, but they're so far away that we don't need to worry about bumping into them. And I think phase two you kind of invented by saying, well, things are changing so fast in the human-driven part of the economy that those limits from nature are getting a lot closer and have in many cases now been passed.
Yes, I think one of the mistakes economists and economic commentators say. The Economist is a very good example of a magazine, a weekly magazine, which is exceptionally able, very bright people. But I think they have misled. They've had a picture of the global economy, which is very different from the one many of us see, is to peer under the economy to see what's at the foundation of it. And the foundations of standard growth and development economics is produced capital, human capital, and ideas. So if you look at the growth models that have growth and development models, or economics of poverty that dominate our teaching and public perception of economic possibilities, nature doesn't really have a role. It doesn't play any. I mean, it comes in as add-ons, of course. There was a period when we worried about natural resources, oil and natural gas, finite, depletable resources. What does economics look like when you have depletable resources? Are there substitute possibilities and so forth? So the economics of climate change is probably the only exception to this, what I was describing. But it has, in some sense, in my judgment, misled us in the following direction. At least as I read the economics of climate change that my colleagues have produced, it sees climate, the disruption to the climate, as a byproduct of human activity. And if the source of that disruption is carbon emission, then the idea would be to move towards clean energy. And so the background picture that drives our perception of the economy is, well, if you make a transition to clean energy, then you can continue with the ideas that you had, which was growth in GDP. And I think that's been a problem, thinking of the climate regulation as being the only service that Mother Nature offers us. There are many, many other services, the ones, for example, soil regeneration, cleansing of water, and so forth. Those are complementary services, the multitude of services that nature provides for us. And to focus on only one and thinking they're not related to, it's not related to the others is probably a big mistake. And I think perhaps one error on our part as economists has been not to engage more with ecologists and earth scientists.
I wonder if we could go on a little about this theme where the economics of climate change is actually diverting us from the key topics of the sustainability of nature. And I think there is something to be said in this argument that if there are technological solutions to climate change, maybe we can just go back to business as usual after we've got the technology nailed down. And one of the areas where I think we're already seeing that run into friction is in the amount of land that's available for use for windmills or for solar panels or for biomass energy. I'm not seeing in that discussion an awareness of the importance of biodiversity, which is why it's so important to see your report on the economics of biodiversity. Right. But I also wonder if you feel like that message is getting through, that solving climate change isn't enough.
It's hard for me to judge that. If you're an advocate of something, then of course you think it's not being recognized. It's sort of a natural state of mind for anybody who's a scientist, I guess. I think on the whole, the discussion has been somewhat narrow, but I like to think that in due course people would recognize that Mother Nature is to be seen as providing us with a multitude of services and goods, many, many uncountable services without which we would not exist. And so to focus on one is a big mistake. And there are so many other symptoms of nature which we can, if you put your species extinction is, of course, one. That's just one, but there are many others. Lead us to think that we are overdrawing on nature. And I think in some sense, the mental picture that I like to encourage us to think of is that we are embedded in nature. And the economic models, formal economic models, that if you work with them, you get the sense that you are like fishermen. We are external to, so we draw on nature as opposed to us being embedded in nature. And that sounds like sort of a poetry, but there is a mathematical structure to this distinction. So I can, it's not poetry, it's real.
Say a little more about that.
Well, by embeddedness means, in some sense, it's a bit like the following. I don't know how much we should go into the model formulations, but typical growth and development economics will think in terms of an output as a function of goods and services that we all enjoy, is a function of capital assets that we create, human capital, produced capital, and raw materials, and so forth. However, the scale of the production function that I've just now described, that is dependent on the biosphere in which economic activity takes place. And if you impose on that, if you press on that, then the scale factor declines. So it's a bit like, formally it will be like some parameter times the output, but that parameter is affected adversely by the output itself, as in the case of climate would be an example of it, which is a byproduct is carbon. But if that affects the climate system, and therefore puts the pressure on your ability to produce goods and services, or have to divert resources in order to mitigate it, then of course there's a feedback which is pressing down on growth for economic possibilities. That can be formalized in a bigger way, larger way, in an all-encompassing biospheric goods and services. That's the idea.
And one of the things I find most compelling about your analysis is the identification of not only these ecosystem services that represent consumption, but those are intrinsic to the ecosystem as well. And how do you think about the interaction between the services that benefit humans directly through consumption and the services that are more intrinsic to the ecosystem properties?
Yes, well, this is a tough area to think about, but it can be done. I found it useful to follow the literature, like most people do, and think of the problem as an anthropocentric one, not put any intrinsic value to nature. Simply think of nature as being a factor into which we are embedded. If you look at it purely anthropocentrically, it takes you quite a distance. But then, of course, if at some stage you need to ask, or you were emboldened to ask, whether that's adequate. And the answer is, of course, it's not. But I'd like to start with the anthropocentric viewpoint, because in case somebody said, well, of course, your views are different from mine regarding the intrinsic nature. And instead of getting mired into a discussion which is likely to prove fruitless, why not stick to the anthropocentric one, saying that we really need it, otherwise we are sunk. So I haven't really spent, it's always the last chapter in my book which I go into that, absolutely. And I do go into it at great length, as you probably have noticed, because one of the things that has bothered me a good deal, the writings of philosophers such as Kant and others who have thought of, they put it this way to you, yes, I was thinking about it last night. Kant and many others of the Enlightenment thought in terms of progress, human progress. And they have sentences telling us how greatly fortunate the last generation will be, because they'll have seen the constructed building, metaphoric building that the human endeavor has. That's very, very, very Enlightenment thinking, that there is progress, and the last generation, assuming there is one, will be, or future generations will be luckier than us, because they will have inherited a grander building, a grander mansion, ideas, goods, and so forth. And when I was reading that, I sort of thought, gosh, how different that class of thoughts are from mine. I would hate to be the last generation. Absolutely be terrible if I thought that I was, because everything that I have, there's nobody to pass on to. And I felt as a father and now grandfather, I feel one of the greatest pleasures is, of course, to be able to pass on thoughts that, pure customs and norms of behavior and household rituals even, that you pass on, and then it gets modified by the next generation and so forth. And so in some sense I see the passing on of our customary activities as a form of self-transcendence. That is, I may die, but something of my things that I value will move through time. So that's why the last generation would be the least fortunate, not the most fortunate, because there would be nobody to hand over things. I don't know if that sounds odd, but it may seem plausible.
I love the concept that you measure value by what you can pass on, and I think that speaks very strongly to the need for protecting the natural environment,
yes,
as well
that's
as
right.
the
Exactly
environment
right. Exactly
that
right.
we create.
Exactly right. Yeah.
And as someone who recently became a grandparent, I also have been really interested in the extent to which the way you view two generations down is in some ways richer than the way you view your own children, that your own children you have an immediate responsibility to care for.
Yeah.
And I feel like being a grandparent is in some ways being able to step away from that and think about what's really important and what will matter in the longer term. And that, of course, brings me to your very important concept of inclusive wealth.
Yeah.
What are the dimensions of inclusive wealth that we haven't talked about that should be on people's minds?
Okay. Those here who are economists will remember from the writings of some of our giants, some of our discipline, Hicks and Samuelson, and even Arrow, actually, because he did write on that. They wanted an economic measure of welfare, and the natural measure for that, these were theorems, was to look at income, national income. It started with Pigou, actually, and A.C. Pigou in his Economics of Welfare thought of a measure. How do you measure whether things are getting better or not? And better means, of course, human well-being. And the idea was to show that if income rises at constant prices, will move in tandem with human well-being. That was a theorem, and it's perfectly right and proper. But what they had in mind was a stationary economy, where relative prices remain the same, proportions of goods and services remain constant. Even if it's expanding, the proportions remain the same. That's a huge simplification, and the question was, does that translate into a workable idea? What indicator you need to study in order to measure the progress or regress of an economy in a world in which you're not in a steady state, where the proportions aren't remaining the same? And what Liran Mailer, a colleague of mine, and a friend, one of my closest friends, and I proved some 25 years ago, was the corresponding result in such a world, in a world which is not constant, the proportions aren't constant, in other words, in a dynamic economy, is wealth. Now, what's the difference between the two is that income is a flow. So if somebody says, what's your income? You say so many $1,000 per year. That's a flow. But when you say wealth, you don't say per year. You say, that's it, so many $1 million of wealth. It's a stock. So you move from flows to stocks, and that's a very significant move. It's a significant move because in a dynamic economy, what you're carrying from one period to another are stocks. Trees, ecosystems, buildings, human capital, you name it. We're moving, it's stocks which you're monitoring. And of course, these stocks are producing services, that's why we want them. But the services are flows, but the stocks themselves are the real thing, okay? Like a table, that's a stock, because it offers this flow of services. You can use it for so many years, as it were. So what you're carrying from period to period are stocks, so you ought to be thinking in terms of stocks, and that's where wealth comes in. And you want to see, well, what's the value of the stocks that an economy has? You need to have prices to attach to these stocks, and of course you move away from market prices for obvious reasons. And for some of the goods will be fine, but for many environmental goods there are no market prices, so you have to have simulated prices, accounting prices, shadow prices they're called. And it's possible to try and estimate them. But what you're carrying with you over time are the stocks, and in economic terms it'll be the wealth. So if somebody says, is this economy progressing? Is it doing well? The idea would be to say, let's measure its wealth and see whether wealth has gone up or down over a period of time. It's the value of all the assets, but socially valued. Obviously, you're looking at accounting prices. And I'm emphasizing the latter because we are looking at environmental goods, which many of them have no prices at all, and that's why we're in trouble. We tend to, they're zero prices, so we don't take them into account when we make use of it, and we put pressure on them. All that's familiar to you. So what I'm trying to say is that you cure it by using prices which are not market prices, but accounting prices, to cover the fact that many of these environmental goods have no markets. But in addition, that alone won't do. In addition, what you need to do is to ask yourself, what are the stocks doing of the forests and the plantations and the ecosystems in general, plus the buildings and plus the human capital? Are they together in some aggregate sense increasing? And that's what inclusive wealth means. So inclusive wealth could increase while some stocks are declining and others are increasing and so forth. It goes without saying, because you're aggregating them. But I like to think now, because of the data we have, that instead of focusing exclusively on inclusive wealth, we ought to focus on the one component of inclusive wealth which is in trouble, which is natural capital. And the reason is that while produced capital, there's a lot of examples now, estimates, that over the past 70 years or so, while produced capital has increased globally and human capital has grown, natural capital has declined. One estimate from the United Nations Environment Programme has it that over the 25-year period ending in 2012, produced capital per capita globally doubled. Human capital per capita globally increased by 20%, but natural capital per capita, with all the errors of measurement that are there, subject to all that, declined by 40% over this 20-year period. So there's been an imbalance here, and that's the decline corresponds to the observation that I was making that there's been species extinctions, that there's more pollution, and so forth. So it's sort of an aggregate way. So there are many ways of getting into this subject. One of them is the aggregate figures, and that's the one that I've just now given you.
I want to ask one more question before turning it over to the audience. Yeah. But one of the things I most enjoyed about the report from the Economics of Biodiversity is your philosophy about how we go about rebuilding natural capital. You make a compelling case for the for the need for action, but then also point out that there are things we can do that can restore natural capital at the same time that we preserve the human experience.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yes.
And I wonder if you can comment on the, I don't know if you want to call it a tension or a range of opportunities between essentially regulatory approaches to saying you just can't fish here versus price signals that can be pushed into managing of different kinds of resources.
Yeah, this is a hoary, a long-standing distinction, regulations versus taxation, if you like. And much of it is absolutely correct. And perhaps, but I think I have really very little in addition to say, because there's so much of it is site-specific, the topic-specific, the service in question, as to what the right way is and how neighboring users can negotiate an agreement of using of natural capital. But ultimately, I'm now getting more and more of the opinion that because so many of our actions are unobservable by others, undetectable by others, we can do things which harm others without that in some sense, I think what we do need is some serious readjustment to our educational system, so that children, as they grow up, find it instinctive not to tarnish their neighborhood. And there are many things that we don't tarnish. That's what's called education at home. You don't do this, mother tells you you mustn't do that, or you mustn't do this, and so forth. There's just huge amounts of regulatory instructions we have in childhood and boyhood. We get it from our parents, we get it from our relatives, we get it from our teachers, and so forth. And I think it would be a transformation of our education system if some of that attention was drawn towards what we do to nature when nobody's looking. That's the key thing. If we think that self-punishment is, in some sense, awareness that something you're doing is wrong, is really needed here, because mostly people can't observe what we do when it comes with trampling over flower beds and so forth. These are small things, I know, but these small things add up into something rather important, big. So I think that's what I've been advocating in trying to bring the education system, the primary education in the UK, to have nature studies as compulsory. And there are quite a number of educationists, at least in the UK, who have taken up this cause, and we're working together to see how to introduce nature studies in a coherent way throughout the education process of children. It takes time, it will take time, but I think that's really rather important. But ultimately, of course, it should come from the home, from the household, from one's parents and neighbors and so forth, as to how you conduct yourself as you go around. I mean, we're instructed not to hit somebody else, right? So we tell our children you mustn't hit somebody, that's bad, and so forth and so on. Likewise, we need to have some understanding.
I can't resist asking one more question. I promise you guys get to come next. But it seems, well, I totally support the idea that strongly culturally embedded educational reform and a focus on natural capital is essential. But it also seems like that's a system which is kind of susceptible to disruption by actors who don't pay attention to the educational messages. And I guess The
That's
implication is we
no,
need
absolutely
some
right.
kind of a balance.
Of course you
between
do. Absolutely.
the
Absolutely.
enforcement mechanisms
That's
and
right.
education.
Now, I think I was sort of emphasizing what I was emphasizing, in some sense as an antidote to our view that it really has to come from outside, a regulatory or taxation. But so much of it should be internal.
Yeah. Okay, we're open for comments. Ken?
I'd like to get.
Oh, actually, I think we have a microphone that we can run. Give me 1 second to get the microphone up here. Madison, very front.
I'd like to get your comments on two contrasting.
Saying who you are.
I'm Ken Caldera, now a visiting scholar in Earth System Science, also with Gates Ventures. So I'd like to get your perspective on two contrasting views. One is what you said about the fish, where you evaluate the asset value of the fish population by its utility in improving human welfare. Another perspective is to say, well, look, the domain over which we've integrated utility has expanded over time. It was white-landed males, and then non-landed people, and non-whites, and including women. And you might think, okay, we should take the welfare or utility of, say, orangutans and chimpanzees and bonobos into account, and maybe with a lesser weighting, snail darters and spotted owls. And so, do we measure everything in terms of its utility to advancing an objective function based on human beings, or do we expand the domain of the objective function to include non-humans?
I'm sorry, I haven't quite grasped your mind. The reason I was focusing on the anthropocentric.
In other words, do we value?
Yes, I can hear you better.
Is all value in terms of its contribution to maximizing some objective function that's defined in terms of humans, or is there some, should we be thinking about definitions of value that aren't reliant on improving human utility?
Yeah, obviously I'm in agreement with anybody who said that it should go beyond simply human. There's an intrinsic, there are these values that the orangutan and so forth. It goes without saying. I think we can go a long way by restricting ourselves to anthropocentric conditions. The reason I do that is that, at least in the early years when I started working in these fields, I always ran into trouble, mainly with actually my American colleagues, economics colleagues, who would say, well, it's all very well, but you give a lot of value to gorillas and so forth, but suppose I don't, who are you to? So I sort of deliberately stuck to anthropocentric viewpoint, and then seeing how far you can go with that. Then you can see the advantage of taking a minimalist position is that if we are so far into ruining nature, that if with the minimalist position you can get a long way, then you avoid unnecessary debates. If the minimalist position doesn't take you that far, then of course you do have to bring in the other things that really do matter. But it's just a strategic reason for my...
Partha, do you have a further comment on how to communicate that when you make these arguments in the practical terms of human welfare, there's still more, that this is really an argument that is designed to be sufficient in some ways, but it's not intended to be inclusive?
That's right.
How do you think about that? And how do you communicate it?
Well, I'm trying to do that here in the sense of the same thing. Suppose you just literally restrict yourself to the anthropocentric, and then you see how far wrong we have gone. Then if somebody then says, well, sticking to that won't lead us that far, even if we were to follow it, then I would say, of course, then we ought to include the further values. But it's as a pure strategic move, I found it useful to stick to an anthropocentric. At least in my book, I come to the non-anthropocentric way of looking at the human economy's dealings with nature at the last chapter, because there's a lot to say that we could do to correct our behavior, our policies.
But the last chapter is still important.
Sorry?
But the last chapter is still important.
Very much so. Oh, yeah.
Third row, second row, and please say your name.
Gunnar Eskeland, Norwegian School of Economics. We've met a few times, all of them memorable. If we look at this audience, we can think of it in the way that humans are the only species in animal kingdom who can reflect collectively over experience and reflect collectively over prospects. I think most of us would think that's exactly what have made us so powerful, so successful as a species. So if we think about that conversation over future prospects, if that conversation were to make us cognizant, across generations, across the globe, what would it take? I take some optimism from your view on public education. I take some optimism from, in my view, the fact that we now have had a couple of generations grow up with animal kingdom. I think it's wonderful. Thank you.
Sorry,
So I guess questions on how to communicate these intrinsic values that go beyond the practical ones. And are we doing it right with things like animal kingdom?
I'm afraid I really you've got me stumped there, because I'm not sure I know how best to answer it, other than to observe intrinsic value. Now, there's a rich literature, by the way, on estimating the intrinsic value by actually asking people their views on the intrinsic value. There's a good deal of that, and that takes you some ways. But that's still, there are deep philosophical problems here, by the way, because this question, is it my view of what intrinsic value is of something, or is there something Platonic out there? There would be huge, rather large literature on that too. I don't find that very convincing because it doesn't get you very far, other than disagreements amongst philosophers on it. But you could, there is a literature which actually in the 1970s, 80s, there was a good deal of empirical work trying to estimate the intrinsic value of particular species by asking people, what do you think? And their answers will be, I am thinking of their intrinsic value, but it's my estimate of that intrinsic value. And at the end of the day, that may be the best we can do. Because who else is going to be there to get the intrinsic value if not yourself or somebody else? It's not, there isn't a sort of a magic statement up there in the sky saying the intrinsic value of orangutans is so much. So you could do that by asking, and it has been done. There was a large literature on that. Interestingly, the way environmental and resource economics developed in the 60s, 70s, 80s, for quite some time, the attention was paid to amenities. A clean beach, a revived coral reef, that class of things, which don't necessarily have a productive value, quote unquote, but they are good things, people that enjoy. So methods were created, developed to estimate the value that we impute to these objects. One of them, for example, in the case of beaches and so forth, would be travel cost, how much people are paying to see the sites, and from that infer how much value they impute to the object in question. And there are other methods that were developed as well. So these were for amenities, and that's what you're alluding to when you talk about the but subsequently, many of us attended to the productivity, to the valuation of the productivity of ecosystems, because they were giving us something more beyond just pleasure. Our lives depended on it: clean water, cleaner air, and so forth. So there's been a shift in some ways in the literature from amenities to productive assets. But of course, the amenities themselves are productive assets. They're giving you these pleasures. But here, it's not so much pleasure, but goods and services which we need or we care about, or something. Does that make sense?
Maybe we can go to one of the side. Oh, okay.
All right.
The microphone.
My name is Oliver Yu. I'm a Stanford alum. I looked at your 2021 report for the data on the GDP per capita that you mentioned. There was a remarkable increase from 1950 to date in all parts of the world. However, it's interesting to see that in Western Europe, the increase from 2010 to today, to 2016, which you reported, is slowing down. And also the most increase, one is what you call the offshoots, which is the North America, and also the most one is in Asia. So I would like to play the devil's advocate in the sense that, as you know, the current administration basically said this climate change is fake news. And also that it's quite a few scientists said that the climate change really is not impacted by human activities. It's really a natural phenomenon. And nothing we can do could change it. So if I look at the data, they can say that this is caused by more strict environmental regulation in Western Europe than the North America, than the Asia. In other words, less strict regulation would increase even more the GDP per capita. And this is what I think the current administration advocates. Essentially, we want to have more, quote, economic well-being rather than what they call a fake environmental well-being. How would you rebut such a argument?
Yes, the question.
So I think the question is that if one were to argue that we're seeing a slowdown in global economic growth as a consequence of overregulation, how do you make the argument for protecting nature and rebuilding economic growth through that route?
Right. It's just that I think it's a very deep question, and not many will find my answer reasonable, but I'm a theorist, so this is not a prejudice, it's a theorem I'm using to justify the claim I'm going to make now. I think it's a mistake to use GDP as the index of economic index. It's a mistake for a variety of reasons. I mean, there are philosophers who talk about it, but I'm not talking about that. I really am talking about the fact that GDP is gross domestic product, and therefore it doesn't include the depreciation of capital assets that accompanies production. And again, so it comes back to the point I was trying to urge us to consider, which is that we ought to be looking at stocks, not flows. And if high GDP is depreciating assets which are actually producing the GDP, then that's not going to, it's going to hit us in the future because you're going to have a lower base on which to have production. So GDP is the wrong measure anyway, and it wasn't invented for any such purpose as a concept, for any such purpose as sustainability. It was invented in the 1930s when about 30 to 35% of the workforce in the West were unemployed, factories were unused, and it was a very reasonable thing to ask to measure economic activity. It was important that economic activity increased to fill up the gaps and so forth. People were unemployed and everything. GDP was and it was a reasonable idea, a measure of economic activity. It wasn't a measure of welfare. Somehow or the other, after the war, when development, growth and development, interest in long-term development arose. In the 1930s, it wasn't long-term development. It was short-run macroeconomic policies to jack up employment. So the attention shifted in the 50s to long-term development, but somehow or the other, that indicator was used to judge success in that long-term process, and that was a mistake. We ought to be thinking of wealth.
I was going to try and go to the side, but I only have questions in the middle. What's going on? Okay, well, why don't we do Larry, and then we'll go over here on the side there.
Well, it's a pleasure to hear you talk, Partha, and to have you back at your home. I think that Oliver Yu's question, former student, can be also addressed with respect to stocks as opposed to GDP. And it raises an important issue that I would be interested in your opinion on. The trade-off may not be necessarily between GDP and the environment, but between environmental capital, which is affected by climate change, and other forms of capital, like reproducible capital and human capital. That's where the tension is. And I think Oliver is asking, what if it's the case that in order to deal with climate change and avoid loss of environmental capital, we're sacrificing a huge amount of these other forms of capital, machines, structures, human capital. So the question that I think this poses, that I'd be interested in your thoughts on, that I know you've done a lot of work on, is how do you value an incremental loss of environmental capital compared to the loss of these other forms of capital? It gets into these issues of shadow prices, accounting prices. Are we good enough at that in order to see whether it's worth losing this much human capital or reproducible capital in order to sustain or prevent a loss of environmental capital? Or is this the wrong question? Should we not even be thinking of this value versus that, but think in more philosophical terms about what's a fundamental obligation? So I'd be very interested if you could spend the next 3 days answering this question.
So, can you just clarify, it's about...
So I think the basic question is, if we are confronted with an erosion of natural capital that allows an increase in produced capital, when is that not worth it? When is it worth it?
Oh, God, sorry, yes, I should have guessed that. The answer, of course, it's going to be, it depends on the accounting prices that you're using, goes without saying. The rule that I was alluding to is movements in wealth, inclusive wealth. So you're looking at the totality of stocks of assets, including the atmosphere as a sink for pollution, of course. And if that wealth increases, then you're on a sustainable path, or at least if your forecast is that it's going to be increasing, that's a sustainable path. The reason it's useful to have that as a benchmark is that it consolidates the Brundtland notion of sustainability, which is you pass on assets to the next generation, at least as much as you had before. But of course, she didn't have tools to ask us to how to judge that, given that some of the assets may have gone up and may have accumulated, and some you had accumulated. And the wealth theorem that I've just now mentioned just crystallizes that. Okay. Now, if you find that, as compared to a decade ago, certain types of assets have gone up and others have gone down in quantity or quality, as the case might be, how do you judge? Well, you judge it by asking what the relative losses and gains have been, which is another way of saying what are the accounting prices. But the key thing is, about even for accounting prices are forward-looking. You can't estimate the accounting price of a stock without having a picture of the economic future that unfolds with the policies that are currently in place and the policies that you expect to be in place in the future. So today's accounting prices is picking up an enormous amount of information, is consolidating an enormous amount of information about the entire future trajectory. We forget that prices are supposed to do that. Very well functioning markets, a market price of an asset will have picked up the future, will embody the future possibilities in it. We forget that, but that is the nature of the beast. But of course, we are moving to accounting prices because market prices don't exist for many, or are at least very far off from what they should be. So, as I said, they will be capturing the future. And the idea of inclusive wealth simply is that it will consolidate the notion that what lies ahead is there are more opportunities today in the future as looked at from today as it was from yesterday if inclusive wealth has increased. That's how I see it.
And would you say it's a fair conclusion from the Economics of Biodiversity report that the erosion of natural capital has already foreclosed on future growth opportunities in the produced capital to the extent that we need to rebalance?
Oh yes, absolutely. There's plenty of examples of suggestions for that. By the way, one of the things that we forget to emphasize here, perhaps we ought to recognize, that although my review was on the economics of biodiversity, I had not very much to say about biodiversity. The intrinsic value of biodiversity, of course, came at the last chapter, so to speak. But I thought of reducing the problems that we face and our embeddedness in nature in recognizing that nature is a capital asset, which is both has intrinsic value as also a means to human flourishing. And by natural capital, I mean ecosystems in general. So I was trying to create a stock-based, an asset-based analysis of the future possibilities, taking nature seriously into account. And I think I was on the whole, that was the right way to do it. Biodiversity has intrinsic value, that's for sure, goes without saying. It has also option values. There will be species whose value we don't necessarily know now, but we think they may be very useful in the future, pharmaceuticals and so forth. Those are standard examples that we use to think. But that's the idea. These are stocks, and you need to value them and put them together into a framework so that when we think about economic possibilities, we have a language which we can carry. Typically, the language has been income, GDP. That's been wrong. And the shift is now towards to assess the stocks. But having inclusive wealth is the right thing. But given the erosion of natural capital that we have witnessed, it's that component that should be our focus, in my judgment now. That for every project that we pass, investment project we pass, then the standard thing would be to say, well, calculate the present discount value of using shadow prices. That's exactly right. And when you do that, it's just bearing in mind, those of you who are students here, that we are used to the idea of present discounted value of projects in project evaluation, cost-benefit analysis. But the present discounted value of a project measures the contribution that project is making to inclusive wealth. Because present discounted value is a stock, because you're adding up the flows over time, and that's a stock. So it's the value of the change in the inclusive wealth of the project. So we've been using inclusive wealth without recognizing that we've been using inclusive wealth all these years when we have said that, look at the rate of return on a project or the present discounted value of a project. That's contribution it makes to inclusive wealth. So that's how I would go about it, I would say. Yeah.
Terrific. I know there was a question at the front here on the side. And I saw a whole bunch of hands. I'm not forgetting anybody.
Hi, Partha Manocha fellow at the Sustainability Institute at Cambridge. My question is, given your policy experience, I think the academic foundation is pretty evident and clear around the arguments you make. What more can we do as academics to influence policy so we can drive the political will, the systems thinking for impact?
I did quite good at that.
What more can we do as academics to make sure that the messages that you're telling us are translated into policy and impact?
I think, far be it from me to judge, it depends on the university in question. But one thing does sadden me greatly is about my own profession, not the engineering department or engineering or the ecology, is that I know of very few economics departments at major universities which have courses in ecological economics. We are a very progressive discipline in many ways. Behavioral economics, no problem. Psychology has entered economics in a big way. But environmental and resource economics, or ecological economics, let us call it that, is usually missing in our teaching curriculum. If we open textbooks of economics, you will see very few markers towards nature, even now. I think that's a big failure on people like myself's part in persuading my colleagues that you can't really have a teaching curriculum on economics without digging into the basis on which economic life is built.
And maybe we can refrain from going into the lack of attention to these issues in the current administration in the United States, but that could be another conversation. Over on this side.
Thank you. Hi, good day. My name is Nitish Dulab from a company called Two-Pot Ventures. I suppose the question I have relates to your definition of inclusive wealth, and how does inclusive wealth relate to regenerative agriculture? When we talk about regenerative agriculture, we're talking about changing our food ecosystem with a focus on regenerating our lands, with a focus on agro-industry, with the focus of biodiversity. So I suppose my question is, as we focus on the regeneration of the land and an improved food ecosystem and a healthier food ecosystem, how are we changing our thinking in terms of the pricing structure of that new commodity that needs an increased demand? Because currently, I think in the US, the focus has been more on the yield than on the actual regeneration of the land. And I suppose my question also relates to, how does inclusive wealth lead to regenerative wealth at the end of the day? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, if I understand you correctly, your question really is a part of a very wide-ranging class of issues relating to land use. And the more you transform the landscape towards agriculture, then what you're losing is not picked up in the value of the agricultural land, because you're valuing it exclusively in terms of its output of food, let's say, just if it's an agricultural piece of. The market won't pick up the losses that have taken place on account of the changing the use of the ecosystem that was once, let us say, a grassland or a forest, and now is agricultural land. And I think that's the way to go about it, that it's overvalued as an agricultural land. You need it, of course, because you need food, that's for sure. What you're not doing is to balance it off with the losses. Does that make sense?
I suppose my question relates, thank you. If we are to change the way we think and the ecosystem in which we're currently working in. It's about how are we developing more of a regenerative way of thinking, but that's also a regenerative way in terms of how we're thinking on our pricing structures in our economy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just looking food as an example of that.
But I think the problem that is you're alluding to relates to not estimating the opportunity cost adequately, opportunity cost of the option that of the use that you're putting it to. And I think the working rule should always be to ask, what have we lost as a result of converting a particular asset from one form to another? And in that conversion process, what's lost are many of the services that go unvalued or undervalued, as the case might be. That's it. That's, the economics of it is straightforward in the sense that you're not asking to do anything that you didn't do before, it's just that revaluing it.
And a whole set of technologies
Yes,
will
and
be
of course,
relevant to
absolutely,
doing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we probably have time for 2 or maybe 3 more questions before a reception starts. And why don't we go to one in the very back there?
And by the way, I'll be very happy to discuss things at the reception.
Hi, thanks so much for giving this talk. My name's Danielle, I'm an alum, and I'm also running a Gen Z climate community in the Bay Area. And my question for you is, earlier you mentioned advocating for education at the primary level, also calling for regulation, and both of those things require a use of voice and speaking out, whether it be from a lobbying perspective for policy changes, or whether it be even like whistleblowing and just bringing awareness to things. And with this current administration, this new administration, all of those things have become much more difficult from a climate lens. And so I'm curious, as you think about the work you're doing to move us towards a price on natural capital, if you have any suggestions or advice on how people can tactically take that forward during these trying times.
So, a question we've heard before, how can we embrace the ideas you're talking about and move them more effectively into the policy space?
Okay. I think I don't have that much of confidence that I can influence today's policymaker. But if I'm a teacher, a professor, I have one influence I can have, is future policymaker through the teaching I do of students today. Because today's students are tomorrow's teachers and policymakers and so forth. So I would take my teaching very seriously, discussions with colleagues, because it's the future, as I say, future policymakers are today's students, and that's the only avenue I have. I personally know very few policymakers. I never have. I'm an academic, sit in my university, and policymakers are sitting in London. And they don't know me, I don't know them.
But when the Chancellor of the Exchequer comes and asks you to write a report, doing that makes a difference.
That's about it. But on the whole, it's been the teaching side I've taken seriously, and that's the only avenue I have to influence things, until, as you say, the review, yeah. But on the other hand, the Treasury hasn't taken the review, hasn't acted on the review at all, as far as I know.
But being right about an important topic is an important starting point for having an impact.
Oh, I'm not at all complaining in the sense that this is how I was asked to do given a task, and I did it to the best of my ability, and I stick by it. But I'm not overly surprised that it hasn't led to much changes in Treasury thinking. The Treasury model hasn't really. It's not quite true. It's that it's like having a marker in. Today you won't have an investment decision made in which there isn't at least a paragraph talking about environmental consequences. Now that may be I think that's probably a change, and for the better. there isn't a full-scale analysis of the environmental consequences to the extent that it's possible to have, given so many of the prices are hard to estimate, as the shadow prices are hard to estimate. On the other hand, one of the things that does puzzle me is how past practices in economics has made us feel that we need to have scalar values, one number, present discounted or rate of return, that we're not used to the idea that of having a range, saying that we don't really know, we can take optimistic and pessimistic estimates and then give a range of possible evaluation of a project. Or project evaluation exercises do point out their zone of in uncertainty regarding the, but that comes as sort of more like a afterthought, as opposed to having it right from the beginning, saying that, look, we're going to be doing, everything's going to be very approximate, and we can only, and there will be some extreme cases where the answer is absolutely one way and the other way. And mostly it's going to be a bit of a fudge in which you have to sort of throw up your hand and argue the case on the basis of where you think the accounting prices actually lie.
When I was looking at the review yesterday, I was struck at the communications value of two numbers. One was the number that 95% of the mass of mammals is now livestock, which
Yes.
blows me away, and I think that policymakers need to hear that. The other is this number that over the last 50 years, the average loss in population size in all the animals monitored was 73%
Yes.
smaller populations.
Yeah.
And simply being aware of the magnitude of the loss of natural
Yes.
capital, amazingly compelling. Over on this side. Sure. You can pick, Celia.
Hi, I'm Leslie Field, and I teach a class on engineering, entrepreneurship, and climate change here for the last 15 years. I'm really interested in climate solutions, and it seems to me that you started off your, where I came in at least, in your speaking about water, and that water is going to be a commodity that predictably is going to become more and more valuable. And if we could credibly predict, that how much more valuable to us clean water is going to be, it would help the world prioritize that as a very important good that's necessary to our lives. And I'm thinking that kind of thinking might be a help to us all to get more active in trying to save as much as we can of what's going on here. So that I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that.
That's a very, very important point. Thank you very much for mentioning it. This brings to the case that we are used to thinking, in most economic calculations, the implicit tendency to think in terms of steady states. So the issue that you raise doesn't arise because the relative prices remain the same. I'm struck by one, let me try and end this, conclude before going to reception, with the following thought. It's useful, in my experience, to convert the entire economics of biodiversity, economics of nature, to an asset management study, because that's what it is. We are looking at assets. They may have intrinsic value, use value, and so forth, but still they're stocks. And so inclusive wealth is part of that story. And so management means that the rates of efficient management, let alone optimal management, means that the rates of return on the asset should be the same. Okay? Maximize the returns, and then, of course, those which you hold in your portfolio will have the same returns. But return is yield plus relative capital gains or losses, which is the point that you just now mentioned. So here is an example which just in some sense tells us, I think to me, dramatically how we got things wrong. So the river Ganges is an asset, and it's a holy river, by the way, for Hindus. And yet it's one of the most polluted rivers on Earth. Okay, so we know it's getting more and more polluted, so the presumption is that the accounting price of the river, or the services, are going up because it's getting worse and worse, which is the point you're making. Now, suppose the government bonds in India is, let's say, you have a return of, say, 5% or so. And if you're holding government bonds and you're making use of the river as part of your asset structure, you would want the returns to equalize, be equal. Now, some years ago, the Ganges action plan of the government of India was analyzed, and a cost-benefit analysis was done to estimate the value of cleaning the Ganges. And in doing that, what they did was to ask people who lived around the Ganges, on the Ganges plain, their willingness to pay for improving the quality of the Ganges water. And the project in question had a rate of return of 15%. Now, just let's take it as let's quibble with it, that's 15%, all right. Now, if the bond rate is 5%, then if it was an efficient portfolio, holding, then there should be a capital loss of 10% on the Ganges water, if they were being held efficiently, because one is 15% and the other is 5%. Government bonds are 5%. The difference is 10%, so it should be declining. But that's absurd because Ganges is getting worse and worse, so it should be going up. So it tells us immediately, one simple example, how the asset management problem is, these assets are being misused, mismanaged, precisely for the reason that you just now mentioned. The capital gains or loss really have to be taken into account. You're quite right.
Okay, I think we take one final question. See a hand right over here.
Thanks for coming. I'm a big fan, so happy to see you here. I'm a PhD student in EIPER here, and my research is on using remote sensing and causal inference to measure ecosystem services using empirical approaches. So one question I wanted to ask you, kind of following up on the earlier question, is why do you think kind of the mainstream economics community hasn't taken up ecological economics ideas as much as we would like? And what remaining research gaps can be filled that can help solve that problem? So my hypothesis is if we can get a more accurate, trustworthy measurement of ecosystem services, for example, using econometrics, right? That's one approach. But what do you think are the gaps that researchers can fill to kind of improve this translation?
The gaps in what?
Why hasn't mainstream economics taken up
I see.
environmental economics, and what can researchers do to make them do it?
I think what students can do is to ask teachers why is it that these issues are missing in the lectures that we hear. I can't think of anything else. I can't speak for the teaching. I'm retired, by the way, so I plead not guilty. But it is the case that while I was active in my university, I was never asked to lecture on this area in my field of research. In fact, I've rarely ever done so. I think the only time I taught it was here at Stanford. That was many years ago, and I was just starting.
And it made a difference here, I promise.
But no, I think I don't know how to answer your question. I think students have an enormous amount of influence on curricula. If they say that things are missing, which I feel we ought to be, why aren't we being taught that? Or why don't we have space for it, as it were, in our curriculum? I think people will, I'm sure faculties will respond to it. But my guess is that that demand is not made. In Cambridge, for example, there is nothing in what we're discussing here in the economics faculty. Why? I can't believe that if students didn't demand it, it wouldn't happen. It has to happen. I mean, there's no ifs and buts about it. But path dependence is very powerful in academia, like, as in many other fields. So it goes without saying, it's very understandable. That's not, it's not a complaint, it's an observation. So if a subject is missing, it remains missing. And tilting it is hard. Items that are missing remain missing. And nature is missing it's a big hole everywhere. I don't believe we require huge activism either. I mean, we're not looking at a really hostile administration saying we can't have anything on nature. No, that's not right. It's just that nobody bothers. I think if few students come and saying, well, we ought to have, how come we don't read, we hear there is a review of economics of biodiversity, how come we don't learn it here? I'm sure there'll be a response, a positive response. But
well, that's a compelling challenge to leave us with. Join me in thanking Partha Dasgupta for a wonderful.
Thank you very much.